Greetings, my friends. This is Celeria Rosenkreuz, and on this episode of the Chronological Quran, episode 27, we shall be diving back into Surah 1, and specifically exploring ayah 6 and 7, which shall lead us to the end of said surah. However, we shall still have a summary to read and then to analyze thereafter. We will start with this. Guide us to the straight path. The meaning of guidance mentioned in the surah. The guidance mentioned in the surah implies being guided and directed to success. As Allah said, guide us to the straight path, meaning guide, direct, lead, and grant us the correct guidance. This seemingly echoes the biblical motif epitomized in Proverbs 3:6, which reads, "In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." Here, this is portrayed as a somewhat passive act which does not require prayer, and which will naturally follow as a result of proper devotion. This is not, however, the only word on the matter. In Isaiah 45, the Lord proclaims through his prophet, "I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his ways straight." Though in verse 4 he had said, "I summon you by name, and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me." Cyrus the Great, who called himself King of Kings, therefore, despite being an unbeliever and a follower of foreign gods, was raised up as a Messiah, explicitly called God's anointed one in verse 1, using that very word in the Hebrew. Thus, more than simply being something that does not necessarily require prayer, this is something which God can do without your desire or will involved at all. You can be rebellious, but if God has a purpose for you, he can direct you to the correct ways and means of accomplishing this, just as we saw in the case of the prophet Jonah earlier in this series. Lastly, it is worth noting that in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews instructs, "Endure hardship as discipline." God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a great harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained in it. Therefore strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make straight the paths of your feet. In so saying, this book makes clear that in the Christian tradition, this straightening of one's path is an active effort, wherein both God and his children are participating, and the latter actively strives to learn and grow as a result of the lessons the Father teaches, under the guidance of the Spirit that dwells within them. That having been said, one might argue that though the actual mechanism of said path correction might be different, Islam and Christianity are still espousing the same thing in this regard, no? Certainly not, for as Ibn Kathir says, "And verily you, O Muhammad, are indeed guiding mankind to the straight path. And all praise and thanks be to Allah who has guided us to this." Meaning guided us and directed us and qualified us for this end, paradise. He would further add, the meaning of as-sirat al-mustaqim, the straight path. As for the meaning of as-sirat al-mustaqim, Imam Abu Ja'far at-Tabari said, "The Ummah agrees that Sirat al-Mustaqim is the clear path without branches, according to the language of the Arabs. For instance, Jarir bin Atiyah al-Katafi said in a poem, 'The leader of the faithful is on a path that will remain straight even though the other paths are crooked.'" At-Tabari also stated that, "There are many evidences to this fact." At-Tabari then proceeded, "The Arabs use the term sirat in reference to every deed and statement, whether righteous or wicked. Hence the Arabs would describe the honest person as being straight, and the wicked person as being crooked. The straight path mentioned in the Quran refers to Islam." With this path being qualified as both a way to heaven and also specifically Islam, it becomes obvious that this is a matter the religion of the Quran greatly disagrees with both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism on. In the biblical traditions, this path correction is not the sum of the religion itself. It is also the case that this creates a sharp point of contrast between Islam and Christianity. Where Islam presents itself as the straight path, Christ declares himself to be the way, and it is only through him that one can reach heaven. These theologies are utterly and fundamentally incompatible, meaning that by definition any claim on Islam's part to be drawing from Christianity must be understood in this context. It is a rejection of foundational Christian beliefs, and what it inherits from Christianity as a source is either twisted from its original meaning and intent or is missing something fundamental, which explains and defines the matter in question. Now, this obviously assumes that Christianity has preserved its source material, and thus Islam must be the one that departed from it, rather than the other way around. This seems to be the natural conclusion given the time gap between religions, and the fact that archaeology has uncovered early manuscripts which support this. However, Ibn Kathir, and consequently all Muslims past the first few generations of them, would claim otherwise. The Jews abandoned practicing the religion while the Christians lost the true knowledge. This is why anger descended upon the Jews while being described as led astray is more appropriate for the Christians. Those who know but avoid implementing the truth deserve the anger, unlike those who are ignorant. The Christians want to seek the true knowledge but are unable to find it because they did not seek it from the proper resources. This is why they were led astray. We should also mention that both Christians and Jews have earned the wrath of Allah. Mind you, Ibn Kathir does not actually clarify what proper resources might have been available, nor why the Christians did not have access to them. Neither does he specify who led them astray. In fact, there is no viable argument that Muslims can make in favor of Christianity in general being these ones led astray, whilst relying upon the Quran itself rather than later contradictory sources. That having been said, we have not actually read far enough in the Quran to properly offer any sort of critique to this allegation other than the fact that it's clearly not the original meaning which the Surah had for Ayah 7. Saying the Jews were those who had earned Allah's wrath and the Christians are those who were led astray ignores the fact that neither group had been mentioned by name at the point that Surah 1 was delivered, and the people of the book had only been mentioned once, at the tail end of Surah 74. If we assume that that surah was actually complete by the time that Surah 1 was delivered, which may not have even been the case. The issue is this. Given Surah al-Fatihah was being delivered to a people who definitely did not think of the people of the book as being wrongly led at the time, this interpretation can only possibly be taken as a retrojection of later belief and context onto the Quranic text. In other words, unless we are assuming that these were words recited completely without any sort of understanding on the part of the original followers of Islam, the interpretation Ibn Kathir is relating, by definition, must be bid'ah. A much more reasonable interpretation would be that the followers of Islam were praying that they not be made like the Quraysh and the other leading families of Mecca, then Becca, nor like the people that those who are in power fooled into worshipping idols alongside Allah. But a not quite sahih hadith is provided, which claims the view that Ibn Kathir espouses. Those who have earned the anger are the Jews, and those who are led astray are the Christians. This hadith was also collected by At-Tirmidhi, who said that it is Hasan Garib. At best, one can realistically argue that those were intended to be very broad categories of people, rather than referring to any groups in particular. And even then, specifying that they must be the Christians and Jews in such a way as Ibn Kathir does as a result of listening to hadith which say this, should be grounds to disqualify a hadith, or the ones who relate it, as unreliable. However, that is not how Islam judges the quality of its source material. The hadith principles are most vexing in that particular way. Regardless, this has been Celeria Rosencreux, and I thank you for hearing my words and joining me in this episode of the Chronological Quran. And now that we are at the end of this episode, I should now probably declare I don't actually intend on going through all of Maududi's description and reflection upon this particular surah. I imagine it would take far, far too long, and so I will look at the tafsir in question And maybe if it has a summary or an introduction, I will look at that and relate it directly to you. I don't want to dwell too terribly long on this particular surah, and so we shall be moving on to the next in the chronology. After the summary, the reflection on the summary, and then possibly a little bit from Maududi. Until then, this has been Celeria Rosenkreuz, and I bid you farewell. God bless you all.